Hey everybody, welcome to Drive Thru Review 706. Today I'm going to talk about Railways of the World. Now this is the 10th anniversary edition box, and I'm going to kind of show you this game through the guise of the Railways of Portugal expansion, which I believe this time is the newest expansion for this. Now if you get the Railways of the World 10th anniversary thing, you get the Eastern US and the Mexico map, which are kind of ideally suited to different player counts because you can play this game from 2 to 6 players. And as you can see, it's a 10-year-old game. And so you get those two in the box, and the Mexico match is a little bit smaller, and the Eastern US is a little bit bigger. Now you can play the bigger map even with 3 players, let's say, because there's some scaling rules for that. So you could do it, but it does give you those access for the player count. And I also have the Railways of Portugal expansion, which I said is the newest. It's also designed by Vital Lacerda, who's made some of my favorite games. And Eagle Griffin actually reached out to me and see if I wanted to take a look at this. And this is a game I've actually been playing for years, never actually owned a copy. But I'll talk more about that in the review of it. But let's jump down to the table. If you're not familiar with the game, I'll kind of show you how it works, and specifically some of the changes with Railways of Portugal. And then I'll come back to what I think. So as you can see here, Railways of the World has been out for 10 years. And really, it's kind of one of 3 games in what you might call, or some would call, the Martin Wallace trilogy of train games, with Age of Steam, and then Railroad Tycoon, which kind of morphed into be Railways of the World. Now, just to give you kind of the idea of the different maps, here you can see the Railways of Mexico and the Railways of Portugal maps are about the same size. And then you have the Railways of the Eastern US, which is just huge. I couldn't even get the whole thing in the frame, but it's basically 3 of the other maps sort of put together. Now, one nice thing they've done with the Railways of Portugal map is they've actually included the score/income track along the side. So if you go back here and look at the right-hand side down to the bottom, you've got the score tracker along the side. Otherwise, the game comes with this giant, oversized score track that's kind of its own board. So this can be quite a table hog. And they do have a Western US map that you can combine with the Eastern US, where you play it sort of in 2 stages. You play the Eastern US, and then at a certain point, I vaguely remember what this is, but you sort of unlock the Western map, and then you kind of move over there, and you're only building railroads over there. So each of the maps has kind of different little nooks and crannies and idiosyncrasies about it, but it's all the kind of the same general system. And not only do we have different maps for different games, we have different card decks for the different games. So here you can see the Eastern US, Mexico, and Portugal card decks. And the cards are a big part of this system, and really kind of almost what sets it apart from Steam and Age of Steam. So in Railways of Portugal, we have the Railroad Operations card, which you're always going to have for a Railways game. But instead of barons, you're going to have goal cards. Now these act just like the baron cards. And what's going to happen is each player is going to be dealt 2 goal cards in the case of Portugal, and you choose one and discard the other. And these are going to be sort of end-game secret bonus hidden objective cards that you're going to have. In addition, you're always going to deal out a certain amount of sort of starting cards out of each of these decks. And then there's these other cards here that are called service bounty cards. You'll take some of these out, shuffle them up, and deal those out, and then deal out some more based on the number of players. So these are cards that players will be able to select over the course of the game as one of their actions. So each player will have a set of trains in their color, as well as a stack of engine level cards, different locomotives that you can upgrade. So you see we'll start at level 1. And then of course their goal card in the case of Portugal, or a baron card in the case of some of the other maps. And then you'll seed the board in the various cities with different cubes randomly drawn out of a bag. And you can see the number of cubes that you put out is the number underneath each of the different cities. And then the game is going to start, and the game goes through a number of different phases here. Now you can see in the first phase, we're going to have the kind of the auction for turn order phase. And then we're going to go into 3 phases of actions. Each player is going to get 3 actions back to back, each player taking actions in order. And then you'll have a dividend phase. You'll refresh the Railroad Operations cards. And then specific to Portugal, this isn't in any of the other maps that I've played, you actually will have some random cubes put out into 2 of the specific cities on this map, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But the first thing you're going to do to start off any game is auction for turn order. And it should be said, I know an auction for turn order probably will turn off a lot of people, but in the main rulebook that comes in this 10th anniversary edition, one thing that they've done is they've kind of compiled a lot of the rules over the course of the last few years and put in certain variants and things that people like to play with, and also some of the other different rules for some of the other expansions. So you can kind of look and see what the other expansions do and be like, oh, I might want to try that one because of this and that. Now, one thing you can do with the turn order is there's a lot of different ways you can play it. You could really just kind of pass it around and just kind of pass it around clockwise and just say, you know, the start player rotates. You could auction for first player and then just play clockwise from there. And I believe that's the kind of the traditional way, the standard way. Or you could do some other different auctions where you're auctioning for specific spots in turn order, which is more like a advanced Steam / Age of Steam kind of idea. But you can really tailor that part of the game to kind of your play style and your group, because it's not really going to affect, I'll talk about it in the review, affect the rest of the game too much. Sometimes it will, and it's probably important to note that. But I would say you can kind of adjust that also per map. So anyway, that's just a little bit of a caveat there with the turn order. You can play kind of that to your style or to your group style. Now, if you do go the auction route, it's worth noting that you don't start off with any money. And here we can see the horrific paper money. It's just, I don't know what it is. We just play with poker chips, but it does come with paper money. But when you start off, if you made it, let's say a bid of $2,000 to go first, you don't have any money. So you have to take one of these bonds. And anytime you need money, you just take a bond, you get $5,000. And then those bonds are going to cost you sort of a penalty or interest at the end of each round. And they're also going to reduce your final score by 1 point for each bond. So there's no way to pay these bonds back. They're not really like loans, they're just bonds. And so there are other cards and things like that that will interact with the bond. So that's kind of an interesting twist on it as well. But it's something that just you kind of have to get used to and say, you know what, I'm taking a bond, you know, right out the gate, just to bid on turn order if you want to do that. Or the first time you build track or something, you need to pay for that. You're taking a couple of bonds probably. So you're just going to get in there, you're going to have a stack of these by the end of the game. You just got to know that going in. So after sorting out turn order, we're going to go into the 3 different action phases, and there's a bunch of different actions that you can do on your turn. And the nice thing about the Portugal expansion, it gives you actually a giant player aid. Most of the other versions just come with small player aids, but this has a nice big one that's easy to reference. And the first action we're going to talk about is building track. And over on the right, you can see the cost to build. So depending where and what terrain you're building the track on, it's going to cost you a different amount. And this is a little bit simpler than a lot of the other Steam, Age of Steam, or even AT&XX style games with how much it costs to build a track. You're just worried about the terrain and that's it. And this game comes with a boatload of track, basically 3 kinds of track. So it's not too crazy, but if you kind of sort everything out when you get the box, it's pretty easy to find what you need. So in this case, if we're going to build track on these 2 spaces, you can build up to 4 spaces on a turn. It would cost us $2 and then $4 to build those 2 tracks since it's on clear terrain. Now you can see this particular map, this is Portugal, has very easy to understand what terrain is what, because you have the little gray dots for mountains and the little blue dots for water. So there's no guessing of if it, what type of terrain it is. So you'll build your track, and then once you're finished with a link between one city and another, you'll put one of your colored trains on it to show that you own it. Now, as you build out track over the course of your actions, you might be building kind of far. Now, this little map here, the Portugal map, you're not really going to run into that issue. But on some of the bigger maps, you might build a few tracks and then need to take another action to continue it. So as long as you kind of close off the link by the end of your 3 actions, then you're fine. Unless somebody comes and cuts you off, then you might have to build, sort of cross-section, track to kind of go over it and under it and that kind of stuff. But as long as you close everything off by the end of your 3 actions, then you're fine. Otherwise, anything that's sort of dangling will just get destroyed and have been a waste of money. Now, the other thing you can do here, instead of track, and this is individual to Portugal, is build a maritime connection. And there are certain spots like this one here where each player can get a chance to sort of build into that. Each player can be on this particular sort of track once. Now there are other spaces where only one player can go, but effectively everybody on this little line here has a link between Madeira and the mainland. And the next thing you might do is actually urbanize a city. So many of the cities are colored, but a lot of them are gray. And the gray cities don't want any particular kinds of cubes, because a red city will want a red cube and the yellow city wants a yellow, and so on. But the grays don't want anything. So an action you can take is you can spend $10 to urbanize a city and basically make that city a color. Now the exception here in Reis of Portugal is if you want to make it a black city, that only costs you $5. But urbanizing a black city has some ramifications, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now, regardless of what you urbanize, you'll take 2 random cubes out of the bag and stick them onto that newly urbanized city. The next thing you can do is you can upgrade your engine. So everybody starts with a level 1 engine, and then you can upgrade it to a level 2 and then to a level 3. You can see the cost to upgrade to that level actually printed there. So to get to a level 2, you've got to spend $5,000, and you can upgrade to a level 2. And the reason you'll do that is to make deliveries. So one of the actions you can do on your turn is actually deliver a cube. So we can see down here in Faro, we have a purple cube, which wants to get up north there. Now, typically with a level 1 train, you can only go 1 link. You can only go from one city to another. You can't jump 2 links, but we've upgraded to a level 2. So we're going to take this purple cube for our next action, and we're going to deliver it 1 spot up north to this gray city, and then finally over to the right. And then that purple cube has gone to its purple city, and we've delivered that. Now, it's worth noting you can use other people's links to deliver on, but your link has to be the one connected to the starting city. So in this case, if we had our link was in yellow and then the opponent's link was in blue, we could still deliver that, but we'll both share the reward for that. Now, when you deliver a cube, you're going to basically get 1 point per link that you go across. So if you go across somebody else's link, they're going to also get a point. And as you move up there, you can see here, you also get your points, but this is also increasing the amount of income that you will get during the income step. And it's worth noting that once you empty a city of cubes, you're going to put an empty city marker on top of it, and this acts as a timer to the end of the game. Based on the number of players, once a certain number of empty city markers come out, that will trigger the end of the game. Finally, the last action that you can do is you can select a railroad operations card. Now, some of these cards that you can see here are actually going to trigger. So once you're the first player to do a thing, you're just going to take it once you meet that condition. But there'll be other cards out that you'll take and do special actions or keep in front of you, or etc., that will just kind of empower your game. And so for an action, you can select one of those cards. Now, after everybody's done their 3 actions, you have kind of 3 final steps. First, you have an income step, and then you'll collect where you're at on the income track, and then paying back $1 for each bond that you have in front of you. And then you'll add a new card to the railroad operations display to choose from. And then specific to Railways of Portugal, you will actually seed 2 random cubes, one to Acores and one to Madeira, until something triggers the industrial age. And so this is different for Portugal. So once a black city comes out, that will trigger the industrial age, and so those 2 cities will no longer get cubes. The other thing that will trigger an industrial age is once you have your 3rd empty city, then that will trigger that will make it a black city, and then no longer will those special cities get extra cubes. So if that goes on long enough, then you can get a lot of cubes on those cities there. So it's a real kind of chicken game there. So that's pretty much how you play the game, with a little bit of the rules there for Portugal. I'll talk more about Portugal in the review part here. But first, let's talk generally, and then I'll get into those kind of specifics. If we go through my pillars of review, first of all, I'll talk player count and play time. Now, I have played Railways of the World with just about every player count. Now, I played it over the years several times. I have played it with 6. I have played it with 3. I don't know that I've ever played it with 2, but I have played it with everything in between. And really, it's enjoyable because at any player count, I should say, because the size of the map is really going to dictate how you should use it. And so with some of the bigger maps, they do have a rule which is like the cube reduction rule. So instead of, if you're playing like a big 6-player map, you can still play it with 3 players, and it's still interesting, I think, because you basically reduce the amount of cubes that go to each of the maps. So you can still kind of play on the big fun map if you want to do that, or you can play in a kind of tighter, more nitty gritty. So you can, again, kind of tailor the game to your needs there. As far as the game time, what does the box say? I always have to look at the box. It says 2 hours plus. And I would say, yeah, I mean, the last time I played this 6-player was probably a couple of years ago, and it probably took us about 2, maybe 2.5 hours. But we'd all played the game, a few times, and we all knew what we were doing. We played Steam and Age of Steam and stuff like that a bunch. So it does come along at a pretty good clip. That the turns are very quick. You can have some kind of bogging down with the auction a little bit, but then the actions get pretty snappy as you go along. And it seems to be pretty snappy. I wouldn't expect much more than 2.5 hours, even at a full player count. And certainly you can get this done hour and a half with 3 players. I mean, I've seen that happen numerous times. So that's kind of the player play count thing. In terms of what is this game like, and maybe kind of comparing it. Well, I mean, I gotta say, Steam was kind of my cup of tea with this sort of trilogy of games and these style of games. I really like Steam. But now having gotten this and playing it a few more times, I think this one kind of is. And maybe it's just something to do with the freshness and the newness and everything. But one thing that I've really liked about this is I've had a good time playing it with my game group over the years. But now seeing how I can kind of tailor this and play this with the family, because they love Steam too. So, which is interesting because that wouldn't be a typical game. But Steam has enough sort of accessibility that it's pretty easy to play with folks. So I wouldn't be afraid of Steam. But one thing that I've realized is because in this game the income and the victory points are like the exact same, where in Steam you kind of have to make that sort of paradigm shift. And I was like, okay, well, I don't know how that's really going to work out now that I haven't played this in a while, kind of coming back to this. But I actually like this better because in Steam, it was always, after you play it a while, it becomes kind of obvious when to kind of make that shift from collecting income to collecting victory points. Whereas here, it's just kind of both. You just kind of do it. And the other thing with Steam is we've played it with kind of the full, like, I call it the Age of Steam variant. You're playing it pretty much like Age of Steam, where there's lots of auctioning and stuff like that, vying for turn order every time. And after you do that a while, it's like, let's just go do the roll selection because you kind of boil it down. Once you get to kind of the math, you kind of jump over that math hurdle. It's like, why do that? Let's just play the straight roll selection. And then now we're playing this with the cards, and I was like, yeah, I forgot how cool the cards were because it just really spices up the map, and it spices up a lot of other things because not only do you have the cards, which I didn't mention in the walkthrough, but you have the major lines. So you have these races too. So it doesn't become just a sort of rote, cutthroat route, selection kind of thing where you're just trying to get those good routes and sort of study the board for 10 minutes and then be like, okay, here's my strategy, and then you go for it. It still has all of that, but this sort of spices up that gameplay with the cards. They get the Baron cards or the gold cards in this case. And then you've got the major lines and all that. So it just kind of spices up in a little bit more variety there. And yeah, it's more streamlined, but I think I enjoy this a little bit better here than Steam now. So it's interesting. And it's a little bit more overproduced and stuff, which is nice as well. Now, specifically with Portugal, I'll just say one recommendation. This is not a beginner's map. Portugal is certainly an advanced player's map. There's a little cutthroat thing on the map there with getting those maritime connections out to Madeira and Lisboa, and or connecting back to Lisboa. And Lisboa is really tight. It has an interesting rule there where you can only make one connection to there per turn, and that becomes kind of a central sort of hub. And it's an interesting thing because you have that sort of very tight little corner of the map, but you also have this weird kind of industrial age rule where you're going to let those cubes build up on those two sort of island cities, or you're going to try to cut that off and then kind of go do your work up in the north. So, I mean, that's just a lot to sort of parse in terms of figure out what's a good idea, because this is really like a 3 and 4 player map, and it's a very crunchy, tight one. So after having played that, I was like, wow, you can really do some really, kind of next level strategy with this kind of style of game here. And so actually what Portugal really kind of sold me on kind of the breadth of the overall system, because, playing with like the Mexico map with the family or or playing the bigger maps, with a large game group, it's really cool because the style of game, really, this system kind of lends itself to being bent and tweaked a little bit, because you can play with the auctions. You can just throw out the auctions for turn order. You can make them really, crunchy and brutal, and, auctions, really fine grained. You've got the different style maps here that you've got, like, really, I think a really sort of advanced complex map here, a cutthroat map, Railways of Portugal. But you can play like a 3-player game on the big, huge map and play open-ended and, big rail lines everywhere, or play on the other smaller, crunchier maps. So you have a lot of flexibility with this system, and you've got a lot of the variability then with the railroad cards and all the different kinds of ways that you can score points, as opposed to some of the other Age of Steam games. So anyway, this has been around for a while. One of the things I'm going to try to do this year is review some of the older games. I've got a couple on my shelf that I've been loving and playing, and over the years I'm like, I never reviewed that, and then it's like, well, that's old news. So I mean, why have that attitude though? So this is really cool. I'm glad I had the opportunity to review this. I would say I definitely recommend this. The other cool thing about this as a package is This has all the Eastern US, the Mexico, the Portugal, all the extra cards and all the bits and stuff. And there's still room to like fit in here, probably good 2-3 other expansions and maps comfortably, I would say. So it's a nice sort of little system to buy, and it's not going to take up, more than this amount of room on your shelf. Whereas like if you try to cram everything into a Steam box, which I've done, I mean, it gets pretty bulging. You're like, what belongs to what here? And but yeah, so I think this is like, just sits in a nice sweet spot in terms of the modularity of it and everything like that. So definitely recommend Railways of the World. If you haven't looked at this game in the last like 10 years or so, definitely look at it, give it a try. It's a lot of fun. Thanks.